Hi, everyone. This is Bill Holton from Field Trial Central, and this is Field Trial Central Live. Tonight, we are honored to be joined by Tom Word, one of the prolific storytellers and writers of our generation when it comes to bird dogs and field trials. And he's just been a great storyteller and super writer. We've all read many short stories that Tom has written, and Tom's an attorney out of Virginia. Got a long history in the field trial game and around bird dogs. And Tom, thanks for joining us tonight.
It's a great pleasure to be with you.
Yeah. So I'll do a little bit of housekeeping here. Of course, tonight we are streaming live on Facebook. We're also streaming live on YouTube. So feel free to share this with everybody get it out to your bird dog friends. Tonight would be one to get to just about anybody because the stories are going to be awesome. And let's just kind of build the word on what we're doing here with Field Trial Central and Field Trial Central Live. Tonight we are going to, really talk about some of the stories that Tom's written over the years, some of the things that he's seen, what he's been doing in the past, and kind of how he got to this point and the amount of knowledge he's gained over the years. It's very obviously when you read Tom's writing that this is someone that's been in the trenches of bird dogs. He's been all around watching handlers and scouts and judges, and been a reporter himself. So this is going to be a lot of fun. So Tom, why don't you go ahead and give us a little history and a little kind of a origin story, if you will, on how you got started with bird dogs and kind of what got you along this journey?
Sure enough. I grew up on a sheep farm in the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia. My father was half a farmer and half lawyer. He was a totally self-educated lawyer. Finished high school, but he got to be a lawyer by reading law under a judge and taking the bar exam. But he died when I was 15, and my mother and I were living on the farm, and we continued to farm until I finished law school, and then rented the farmland to a neighbor while I went to finish law school and started practicing in Richmond. And she lived there till she was 99 with my sister. So I'm very much a person of the land and of the farming background. I started bird hunting when I was in high school with a single barrel 20 gauge that I saved my first earnings with to buy for $12.95. And I hunted grouse in high school in the mountains of Virginia without a dog, just walking and stopping every 10 steps or so and waiting to hope one would flush. Then after I got in law school, I met there Bill Anderson of Danville, Virginia, who was a great setter guy. And he took me back to Danville, where he was from, for the opening day for several years. We'd hunt rabbits in the morning and quail in the afternoon. And we did that on a farm owned by a guy named Fred Leggett. And that farm was a famous field trial ground. It's where the Virginia Carolina Club, which was on the major circuit way back in the 60s and 70s, the major circuit handlers would go to New Jersey in the spring and then come back, and the last trial of the season would be at Danville. And some of the great dogs in America ran there. It's a single course, but a great course on the bend of the Dan River. And in those days, the great handlers came there for the last trial of the season. But when I was there in the early 60s, it was the federal land bank was in effect, and there was Lespedeza everywhere and wild quail everywhere. So we had a great time there. And Billy introduced me to a guy named Arthur Bean, who was one of the classic early shooting dog trainers, and he trained dogs for Bob Whaley. Whaley would send him dogs that he was going to run in major amateur competition, and Arthur would polish them. And Arthur taught me what class was in the dog. I never reported a trial in those days. I had a couple of dogs with Arthur, but I was more working in bird hunting, and I would go to weekend trials. But in 1986, a client took me to Scotland to hunt grouse because the client had sold a business and made a big kill. And as a thank you, he took me there. And on that trip, I met Ted Baker. He was one of the 9 guns shooting driven grouse. My one and only time shooting driven grouse. And I wrote an account of the hunt and sent one to everybody who was on that trip, and put snapshots with it. And Ted then called me up and said, I loved your account of our hunt, and I want you to come report my field trial. Well, finally, in 1995, I did. And I'd never seen a wild bird continuous course major circuit trial. But once I saw that one, I was really hooked. And I've reported it every year since 1995. After reporting that trial, I started getting invitations. And I reported the Continental right after that for several years. Then I reported the Invitational in Paducah, which was one of my favorite things to do, despite the fact you freeze every Thanksgiving weekend for 10 years. And then I got invited to go to the National Amateur Free-for-All in Union Springs. And that was a real treat because I met Ed McFerrier, and he put me up in his home, he and his wife Floyd, for several years. And I both judged and reported that one. But Ed Mack really fussed at me about being both the reporter and the judge at that. He said, you should never do that. But he was just a marvelous font of knowledge. His book is one of the real classics of the sport. There's more good information in that book about the bloodlines of the great dogs than anything. We spent a Saturday, they didn't run on Saturday because they got too many college kids if they did. And we spent a Saturday going all over Alabama. My mother's family was from there, and we went to all the places that his family knew and where my family ancestors were buried, and we just had a marvelous time there. I then got invited to report the North Dakota trials up at Columbus, and then the Oklahoma trial. I reported and judged the National Amateur Pheasant Championship when Miller's White Powder won that. And I just have had a marvelous time being invited around to these wonderful venues and seeing these great dogs. And I consider it a great privilege, and getting to know the handlers and the owners and the landowners and the people who put on the trials has just been a wonderful thing in my life. I'm now about to be 82, and I only report now the Florida Championship, which is my vacation for the second week of January. I go to Chinquapin and I ride on top of the dog truck with Cowboy driving. You can see as much at that trial on the truck as you can on a horse, because Cowboy will drive to the points, and you can see what all the scouts are doing, and it's just a great privilege to do it.
Yeah, it sounds great. That's a trial that I've talked about this on previous shows, but that's both Dixie, at the Continental and the Florida are two trials I'd really like to go and visit. I think those are obviously two very different kinds of grounds from what I surmise, but both very interesting and great wild bird trials.
Yeah, well, Chinquapin is a lot like Dixie, except it's a little more open and it's full of hogback ridges. So you can ride the ridges where the courses run, and the courses were laid out there by Fred Arant. He went down and complained the first year that they ran the trial because the courses weren't well defined. And he stayed for an extra 2 weeks and laid them out. And they're still run on exactly the way Fred Arant laid them out. The first one trial there was in 1969. And for 10 years, it ran as an open all age, and then it became a championship. But it's a fun place. And it's the great thing about it is it's covered with quail and they're evenly distributed. So no matter what course you draw, you've got a chance to point a lot of birds. And of course, they'll cut off though. I mean, you can we had a trial one year when we had only 1 or 2 bird maximum number of finds. They just when they don't want to be pointed, they don't get pointed.
Yep, that's wild birds. Yeah. Oh, that's the kind of stuff that'll happen. Yeah, there's a few things that I kind of had in my head that I wanted to kind of ask you about. One of them was Ted Baker. Obviously, you've got a long time relationship with Ted, and there's got to be some great stories, involving Ted over the years, and whether it's at Chinquapin or anywhere else.
On my blog, tomwordbooks.com, I wrote recently the first of 2 pieces of an account of Ted and T. Jack Robinson, who were great friends and co-owners of Builder's Edition and other dogs, and 2 great guys to party with. But Ted has been about as generous to the field trial game as anyone. He sets aside a 2-section portion of the preserve there full of wild birds called Longcalla, which is named for the company that used to own it. That's for the handlers to use when they're not running a dog. They can go run their dogs there and train them. And coming the week before the Continental Derby Championship, that is a tremendous opportunity for a handler who's got a good derby coming on that he wants to run at Dixie to get that dog acclimated to sandy country. Because a dog from the north, when it comes into that sandy country, it needs to be acclimated to the sitting conditions. And that's the ideal place to do it.
Yeah, I could believe that. It was interesting. A few years ago, I judged a trial with John Russell, and he in 1 or 2 evenings, I don't know how many stories I heard about T-Jack. So, that seemed like, must have been quite a pair. And T-Jack himself, there was a lot of great stories surrounding him. I'm sure you spent some time around him over the years.
T-Jack was a wonderful friend. In 2003, I had open heart surgery, and it went fine, except the day afterwards, I had a temperature of 105. I got one of these hospital infections. So they put me in a medically induced or chemically induced coma for 3 weeks while the infectious disease doctor tried to find something that would knock out the infection. And T-Jack called my son every single day for 3 weeks to check on me. He was that kind of guy. And he was a great friend to John Russell. And John, of course, has his finest moment was running the top qualifier at the Florida Championship with a son of solid reward that he had trained himself. And he loves the trial. He's judged it, and he's there every year. And as you know, he's written a marvelous book about the Invitational, which he was the chairman of for about 20 years. And it's got more bird dog history and the lineage of all the great all age champion. So he's just a great giver to the sport.
Yeah, yeah, and I should mention that I'll put some links down in the bottom underneath this video of Tom's books that are available for purchase, and if you don't have them, I'd surely recommend getting all of them. And John's, we'll mention the invitational book again, and we'll get that up there, and try to get a few more people with their hands on that information, because it's great reading, and those are. I'm one of those guys that I get to go through spurts where I read quite a bit and then I don't read enough for quite a while. But I've got American Fields dating back to the early '60s, and every once in a while I'll pick them up and I'll just spend a couple of weeks reading, old fields from the '60s or '70s or '80s, and it's pretty fun. So that's you can see why I enjoy having a conversation like this with you tonight. So. So, you obviously saw a lot of great handlers over the years, but recently we lost a great one in Robin, and we've talked about Robin on a few shows, but give us some insight of what you've seen with Robin handling over dogs over the years, and some stories there.
I first saw Robin handle a dog in 1976 when he had a shooting dog string. He was maybe 20 years old. And he was running in the Eastern Open Shooting Dog Championship in Virginia. And he had maybe 10 dogs, and every one of them could have won any shooting dog or all age if he just blow the whistle a little harder. I mean, they were really great dogs. And then I would see him occasionally at the shooting dogs, but then when he switched to the all age, I didn't see him anymore until 1995 when I started reporting to Florida, and I saw him every year from 95 until his death. I saw him at Chinquapin. I saw him have probably the greatest performance I ever saw there with Silverwood in 2002. I saw him win it several times, and he was. I admired him so much because he'd overcome a problem with alcohol, and I never saw him when he'd had a drink. He just did not drink anymore after he got through that. And the great thing was when his son started scouting for him, and watching those two together was great. And there's a funny story about one year. I reported to Florida. It was a year I turned 60, and I said, I'm going to prove I'm still a man. So I reported to Florida, which had 105 entries. And we finished up on Sunday afternoon. Well, the Continental Derby started Monday morning. So I ran up to Dixie. I started reporting the Continental Derby Championship, which had, I think, 50 or 60 entries. Then the Continental All Age had 115 entries. And I rode horseback 28 straight days in a row. And every night I would get off my horse and go get in a bathtub with Epsom salts. And somebody had told me, and it saved my life, that if you wear pantyhose like a cowboy, it would keep you from getting chaffed from all that riding. And I would go in the Winn-Dixie store and buy pantyhose and Epsom salts to soak myself in. And this lady at the checkout counter, about the third night I did that, she said to me, honey, do you mind if I ask you, what are you doing with them pantyhose and Epsom salts? And I was like, well, the first year that Hunter scouted for Robin, I was in a motel on the highway when I was reporting at Dixie, and I took my clothes to the washroom and was laundering my pantyhose and my other clothes, and I left them in the dryer, and when Hunter came out and found the dryer full of my clothes and pantyhose, and Robin said he came back to the room and said, "Pop, is there something funny about Mr. Tom?"
Oh,
They
that's
were right
awesome.
up there. And Hunter knew that Robin, like all of us guys who've had a lot of shotgun shells around our ears, was getting a little hard of hearing. He would yell at his daddy, and they had to be like Indians sending smoke signals because Robin couldn't hear him.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, those are great relationships, and Robin obviously touched a lot of people in the sport and made a big impact on dogs and people, and obviously, very dearly missed. So it's great to hear some good stories with Robin.
Most people know who are involved in the sport, but Robin's family and Bubba Moreland's family were like brothers. And Big George Moreland used to say about Robin, he said he went from being an alcoholic to being a workaholic, because he had a tremendous work ethic. He worked his dogs, and he really, in later years, he loved to work his dogs a lot more than he loved to go to field trials.
Oh,
but he worked them.
Well, I resemble that remark. I mean, I love to go to field trials, but yeah, it's the work in them is really the enjoyment for me these days. And I think that's, become a lot of guys as we, move along in the sport, but field trials are still awesome and they're a lot of fun, but it's, there's not, I hadn't heard that before, but it doesn't surprise me at all with Robin. So, tell me about, so you mentioned, and that obviously was a question I would have. What's some of the great performance you've seen at the Florida, maybe at Dixie and other places too? Some, Silverwood is one that would get mentioned, I think, with a lot of people at different grounds. But what else? And tell me what you liked about Silverwood there.
Well, Silverwood had 4 fines in that race, and he ran on what is really the greatest quail course in America. I think it's the second morning course, our course which begins at the top of Buck's Hill, which is where Chinquapin Bisco Buck is buried. And it offers everything you could want. There are deep swales. There's an area that it's like prairie. It slopes in one direction so you can see a dog running on the edge. Then it makes a turn. And in that particular race, he had 4 evenly spaced fines going around that course. And when he finished probably a mile further ahead than any dog I ever saw hunt that course. He finished out the front, all the way back to the second corner of the course. And everybody who saw it, Calvin Davis was there. And when it was over, he said, "Boys, we're all running for runner-up. We're not running for champion." And Luke Weaver and Vernon Vance were the judges. And when Robin got through, he said to Luke, who's a longtime pal, he said, "Have you seen one better than that?" And Luke said, "Well, I think when I saw Bubba get top qualifier at the Continental one year, it was a little better." But he says, "I like Bubba better than I like you." Just teasing.
Yeah.
It was just one of those middle ones. But probably aside from that, the most remarkable thing that I got to see was House's Rain Cloud winning the Invitational 3 years in a row. And he won it hard. One of those years they named no runner-up, but he won it hard 3 years in a row. And why he's not in the Hall of Fame is just a shame. I mean, he ought to be in the Hall of Fame, and every knowledgeable dog person knows that. He just never had the campaign that it takes these days to get a dog in there. But he really ought to be there for the sake of the Hall of Fame.
Yeah, I know when Gary was on, he mentioned a performance, and we were talking the same way. The great performance he'd seen. He mentioned House's Rain Cloud running at Paducah in the Invitational, and I can't remember, but there was 2 or 3 people that made comments in the video that House's Rain Cloud should be in the Hall of Fame. It's fairly. I think it's a widely held belief. I don't know for sure why it hasn't happened yet, but I guess you're right in the sense sometimes it takes that campaign to kind of and as time goes by, it's harder and harder for
that's right
those dogs to get in that probably are deserving.
Yeah.
So, I was thinking. So you judged in North Dakota also. You've been to the Prairie in Canada also?
I've never been. I've never been to a trial in Canada. I've been to trials in North Dakota, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Oklahoma, all over the South. Oh, I've also reported for several years in a row the free for all, and I got to see Solid Reward win the Florida, and the same year win the free for all, and then in the national he had 12 or 13 fines 3 or 4 years running. But he was definitely an endurance dog.
An endurance dog, and obviously a very good bird dog.
Yeah, and a good sire as well.
Yeah. So I think I remember, reading that story you had with T-Jack and Ted Baker.
Right.
Do I remember you talking about endurance? Was that
endurance? Yeah. Bill Rail became the handler for T-Jack and Ted at the same time in the late 60s. And Phil Brousseau he was quitting the circuit, and he had dogs for T-Jack, and he said, why don't you try Bill Rail? So T-Jack called Bill Rail and talked to him about handling dogs for him. And Bill said, I've got a really good Derby prospect. I need somebody to pay his way to Canada. If you will sponsor him to Canada, you can buy him for $1,000 when you get back. You don't have to pay for him now, and it's an option. I'll let you have him for $1,000, but if you don't want him, you don't have to take him. So T-Jack paid Endurance's way to Canada. While he was up there on the way back, he won the U.S. Chicken Championship in Wisconsin. So he was a champion as a Derby. And Bill Rail said, you can still have him for $1,000. So he bought it. And then in 1970, Endurance won the Continental All-Age Championship for T-Jack, and that started the Bill Rail relationship with T-Jack. And about that time, Ted Baker got a chance to buy a Derby named Bill Possessed from a fella Jacksonvillian, Tom Kennard, and bought him as a Derby. And the week after he bought him as a Derby, he won the Continental Derby. So that made T-Jack, Ted, and Bill Rail a threesome that, as long as Bill Rail lived, they were a threesome. And Endurance was a tremendous producer. He produced a dog named Omen that won the first all age at Chinquapin, and he won this. They ran a derby as well. He won first in the derby, first in the all age, and then endurance won third in the all age. So that matchup of Bill Rail and his dogs and those two guys really they made a team. And Bill Ball had Builder's Edition, and it was right at the time that a building recession came along, and Bill Ball was a home builder, and he was really short of money. And so Bill Rail called up T-Jack and Ted and said, I got this really good dog, and a Gates owner's going to buy him if you don't. But they were having hard times in their businesses too. So they said, I can't pay $10,000 for that dog. I know he's worth it, but why don't we split it? So they each put up $5,000, and they got Builder's Edition, which went on to win the Invitational once, runner-up at the Invitational twice, and the National Championship. And that's one of their great favorite things.
Yeah, it's amazing how important the teams are, when you start, going forward in this sport, and how people have been successful over the years, both the handlers and owners and the dogs themselves, and how we've talked about that in the past. It really takes a team, and in some cases it's a partnership with ownership and then obviously the handler, so that's just a great example of that.
Lee West used to say, a handler can get dogs, but getting good owners is a lot harder than getting good dogs. And he had a way. He would develop a great derby and sell it to Tom Fowler, but keep an interest. His deal was that his name would stay on the dog, and when the dog was retired from the circuit, he got it back to hunt. So he really had a lot of great dogs, and he was a wonderful friend and character too. It was
he
dogs won, I'd get to call him up and tell him about the race, and that was always an experience.
Yeah. Judge Lee West really made an impact on the sport and on handlers throughout, obviously in the Midwest. And so you got to spend some time around Lee West?
I did, and he judged I met a lot of really great guys who were judging the Invitational, and they educated me on what an all-age dog was supposed to be doing. Another one who judged two of House's Rain Clouds wins at the Invitational was Marshall Lofton, and Marshall was a wonderful teacher. He would tell me what a dog was doing great and doing wrong. He also, being a handler, he knew what people were up to by way of scouts and so forth. And one of the things he was very aware of was at Paducah, there are a lot of roads that parallel the courses. And he said, I won't name the handler, but he said, watch so-and-so's wife. She's got a little pickup out there. You watch her, you'll see her one spot, and the next thing you know, that dog is going to show up right at the front, way in front of her. Mm-hmm. And it didn't get there on its own. But he knew all of the tricks and was great to educate me. Another great judge that judged one of those rain cloud races was Cecil Rester. And I'd gotten used to asking judges questions as the trial went along about what they thought about dogs. And most of them would tell me because they knew I didn't know a damn thing, and they were trying to help me be a good reporter. And Cecil just stared at me. He would not say a word. And when it was over, Cecil said, okay, I don't talk to anybody but a fellow judge while I'm judging, but I will sit down and tell you everything about the three races that this dog had. And he sat down and spent an hour explaining to me all the great things that Rain Cloud had done, which was a great education. He's a tremendous dog man.
Yeah. Huh. Yeah, that's great. It's great to have somebody that'll spend that time, and you really do, can glean a lot of information from those guys once they've watched. They see a dog go a place, and they have a reason why they like it, right? And it's so great when they can explain that to you.
And they'll also tell you, you'll see one you think's doing great, and they'll say he ain't hunting a lick, he ain't using the wind, he's on the path. Yep. He's all show, all hat, no cattle. Yep.
Well, that's one thing I think that's important with good judges, right? They see it's easy for all of us to kind of see that this dog went from here and they went to there, but the good judges have got the experience to know why they are doing what they're doing, or at least how they feel, what they think is happening there, and they're generally going to be pretty accurate about that. And you're right, in some cases they're just running to hear the wind go through their ears. And I did get to spend a little bit of time with Marshall Lofton at Solon Springs, Wisconsin. What you're talking about, where Endurance had won on the way back, and just kind of, you don't get a lot of time with those guys. I haven't, but boy, if you listen, you can sure pick stuff up. It's awesome. Envious of all the time you've got to spend with some of those great handlers and looking at some of those great dogs.
Well, one thing when I started out, I said, well, the judges always get fussed at, but they don't know what the reporter is going to say while they're there. And they only read the reports a couple of weeks later when it's out. So, but I learned very quickly that an owner or a handler never forgets any slight that you put in a report about his dog. He'll remember it. He'll come tell you about it the next year and the next year, and from then on. And I had one instance where a handler didn't like something I said. I didn't really realize it, but he was then put in charge of supplying me at horses at a particular trial. And he tied up a Palomino horse to a tree. And I went over and said, "Is that the horse I'm supposed to ride?" And he said, "Yeah." Well, he'd forgotten that when he had that horse, and I said something about him at another trial that was run on his home grounds. I said something about that's a beautiful horse. He says, "If I ever put you on this one, you'll know I don't want you to be here." And lo and behold, that's the horse he had tied to the tree. And on the first brace that morning, it was a scout horse. And on the first brace, somebody called point, and that horse went out. I mean, he took off like Secretariat for that find. And I stayed on when he got there. But once the find was over, I slid off that horse, and I said to Ricky Fernie, I said, "Ricky, I can't ride that one. You're going to have to find me something better." And Ricky had an old horse that he kept for owners that was calm as could be. And he says, "I got the horse for you." And he put me on that horse, took care of me. But that handler had it in for me. He was going to get me. He was going to get even for something I'd said about his dog. I don't know what it was, but it was a clear message.
Yeah, no, guys do. They remember when you're talking about their dogs. It's you could say it about them and it doesn't hardly bother them at all, but the skin gets a little thin when we're talking about the dogs.
Sure enough.
So let's talk about the writing outside of the reporting, right? So you've written 6 books. And I'm sure you couldn't even come up with a number of other short stories. What got you started writing about this kind of stuff in more of a fictional way, or maybe semi-fictional in some cases?
Well, all fiction comes back to some instant that you remember from reality. You can change the places and the names and all, but and it is fiction, but it's inspired by what you've watched. The practice of law is mostly about writing. You're either writing to convince a judge or writing to explain something to a client and that sort of thing. So getting the words on paper wasn't hard for me, but I was always, my father was a great story reader and teller, and he got me interested in reading early. He had me reading Jack London stories and the O. Henry stories and that sort of thing. And I had enjoyed literature in college, and then in middle age, I got the inspiration, don't know where it came from, to write a novel about field trials. And the plot of it became the only novel that I published, which I had to self-publish, which was Gentlemen Let 'Em Go. And it's about a farm boy who's orphaned, and a handler takes him under his wing, and they go on to win the national championship with a setter. But when I got that inspiration, I was trying to figure out, how do I get this published? So I knew that Donald McKeag, who had moved to Virginia from Madison Avenue, where he'd worked in advertising and become a sheep farmer, had written a great book called Nop's Trials about a border collie named Nop. And we had a mutual friend, and I got the mutual friend to introduce me. And I wrote Donald and said, can you give me some advice about a publisher? And he wrote back and said, send me your manuscript, which I did. And then he called me up and said, I'm coming to Richmond on a book tour, and I'd like to meet you. So he came to Richmond. I took him to lunch. I got him a single malt scotch, and we sat down, and he said, I've got some bad news and some good news. He said, the bad news is your manuscript is not publishable. And then he said, but maybe with some work, it can become publishable. He says, here is the manuscript that you sent me. I've marked it up, and he had an edit on every page. He said, rewrite it, send it back to me, and I'll go over it again and give you edits. And he probably did that 6 times over the course of a couple of years. Then he said, it's publishable, but you probably won't be able to get a publisher to publish it because there's no money in dog stories. So I ultimately ended up self-publishing it, which is not expensive at all anymore with print on demand. It was the first one I did because I had to pay for 800 books up front. But Donald and I became very, very close friends, and he was just a marvelous man. He died in 2018 of basically lung problems, but he was a great guy. And he fought a battle with the AKC, whom he did not want to register border collies because they always put a conformation standard on dogs. And that's what ruined the Irish setter as a bird dog, was putting the show conformation standard in. And he fought them tooth and nail. They finally did it, but the breeders of the working border collies won't register them with AKC, and they hate to see an AKC registered border collie around.
Yeah, I can believe that. That's from a guy that's had at least one Irish setter in my kennel since 1991, I think, maybe maybe 19, yeah, somewhere around there. I've always had at least one red dog around, and all obviously, great field dogs, but yeah, it's been I understand his dilemma there. That
Yeah, well,
we saw what happened.
Every red dog you see winning field trials is crossed with a pointer, and that pointer is Miller's Silver Bullet, and Farrell Miller will tell you straight out, and any number of red dog guys has told me this dog's father is Miller's Silver Bullet. And
yeah, they're definitely one.
And there's some great dogs.
Yep. So I'm just going to throw up here a little share to my screen a little bit, just so people can kind of see some of those books, right? We got Gentlemen Let Them Go, the first one you talk about, The Ninth Pup, which was the very first one I got of yours before I jumped into the rest of them. The Curmudgeons is a great bunch of short stories, and we've got a pretty some recurring characters in these stories of Ben Reach and Dr. Sam Nixon. I'd like to give me a little bit of background on where those people came from. But then there's also None Held Back, A Little Competition, and The Price of Admission. So give us maybe a little feedback on where Ben Reach and Dr. Sam came from.
Ben Reach is me. He's an old curmudgeon lawyer who's seen a lot of human nature, good and bad. And Sam Nixon was the name of the country doctor who delivered me. I just borrowed his a name for the story, but Sam Nixon, the doctor, was a field surgeon in the Vietnam War, and he and Ben Reach are characters, and they try to help people from all walks of life in the area of the Quail Belt. And those stories are all about the interplay between the rich Yankees who own those places, some of them rich Southerners now, or rich Californians, the crackers who are their dog handlers, and the blacks who have been there since slavery days, and the interrelationship between those three interdependent folks is the theme of those stories. It's about the good and the bad of human nature, and I like for them to have happy endings. They don't all, but most of them do.
That makes for great literature when those types of stories. So they've been fun to read.
You have to have conflict to make a story. You've got to have a good guy and a bad guy, or a good thing happening or a bad thing happening. And the None Held Back, which is inspired the first collection I published, was really inspired by Arthur Bean. When Arthur retired from the shooting dog circuit, he would still raise puppies and break gun dogs for people, and he'd do a marvelous job of it for me. And I'd go spend a day with him and hearing the stories of all the things that happened. One of the great Arthur Bean stories was he had a great dog named L.U. Summer Tan that when they started the National Open Shooting Dog Championship, and they ran it at a beautiful place called Hawfield that a guy named Guy Lewis developed in Orange County, Virginia. It's just a gorgeous place. And Arthur had won it hands down. I think he'd had 4 or 5 fines, and they had a requirement that the dog must demonstrate a back. And so they put a bird out for another dog and got it on point. It was sort of stuck into a hedge pointing, and they said for Arthur to bring his dog in and get it back. And the dog came up and looked and went over and took a leak on the dog that was pointing. So he didn't get that. And I'm telling you, I've heard Arthur tell that story so many times. And that's why most of the championships that had a back requirement changed it to say you got to have a back if the opportunity presents itself.
Yeah, I've actually seen some of those setup situations. They are always tough. They don't always work out that well.
That's right. The dog is not real.
Yep, that's right. Well, so I'm gonna, like I said, I will put some links to those books down below. Everybody, jump on and pick up some of those books. Get yourself some summer reading. Every few people are still locked at home these days, and I know a lot of times these questions come up, whether it's in kind of the dog days of the summer before the guys are starting to work bird dogs, and we get the same thing around Christmas time. But those are great things to have on the shelf to be able to grab and read a quick short story or two, and you'll really enjoy them. You surely would not be disappointed. One question, and we're going to start wrapping up here because we've been holding you quite a while tonight, Tom. But one thing we haven't talked about is the scouts. So, tell me about some of the things you've seen or some of the great scouts you've seen over the years at those trials, mostly all over the place, I guess. But, you get a lot of them in the Southeast, and there's a lot of characters there. But I know you've written about scouts in the past.
The economics of being an over-the-road handler now make it such that most handlers cannot afford to have a salaried scout. They do the helping each other thing where two guys will enter their dogs as a pair and scout for each other, and that's fine. But up until the early 80s, almost every handler had a black scout. And those guys were fantastic horsemen and woodsmen, and they could track a dog tremendously. They worked the dogs at home. They knew their habits. They knew if they were a left-handed dog or a right-handed dog and all those things. Those of you who've seen dogs on the circuit know that Joe Bush and David Johnson, who are about the last two around, Joe is handling dogs more now than scouting, but those two guys could do most anything scouting. David Johnson started out scouting with John Rex Gates, and then scouted with a number of people, but up until T-Jack's death, he was scouting T-Jack's dogs. But David Johnson, if you watch him ride at a trial, and he would ride almost every brace, he would be watching every dog that was running, not just his dogs. And he would help people out by showing them where their dog was or where they should go to find their dog. And I've never known a greater gentleman than David Johnson. And those guys, I think, should be in the Hall of Fame, and they ought to go in. In the old days, they used to do what they call the Old Timers Committee, and they'd get people out of the distant past and put them in the Hall of Fame as a class. And I think all those classic black scouts like Robert Burris and the guys I just mentioned, and a number of others, Joe Odom, who scouted for Fred Aaron, any number of people that deserve to be in the Hall of Fame.
Here, I agree with you. That's awesome. I mean, I couldn't agree with you any more. And it's a great way to kind of, wind up our conversation. I think that's, one of those things that I think needs to be recognized. I mean, these guys gave everything they had to, trying to get dogs ready and help the handlers and get dogs, around and winning, and they should be recognized as such. And I'm glad you brought it up. It's awesome. Before we wrap up, I want to just throw a couple comments up here. We've got some great visitors here tonight. One of our great young handlers, Jamie Daniels, says Tom Word is one of the best. Thank you for all you do, Tom. See you in Florida. So, Jamie, thanks for being on tonight. I know Tom sure appreciates it.
Yeah, Jamie's. I watched Jamie apprentice, and he has really brought on some great dogs.
Yep. Great guy and great family. Here's another Gary Ansel. Says, hey, Tom, I hope you can come to the Virginia 100 amateur field trial. I'm a member of the trial. I'd love to have you there. So there you are.
I had planned to be there till it got canceled. And I've got to write the second for the history of that for the field.
Yep. Great. And another one of our great handlers in the past, Rich Robertson, in the past, I say, currently still, Rich Robertson Jr., Tom. Yep.
Rich is one of my favorites and one of everybody's favorites.
Yeah, absolutely. So we had another question here, and you may have an answer on something like this. Rafael Franco made a couple comments here. It says, Tom, any Llewellyns in your past?
Not really. The definition of a Llewellyn is a dog that goes back in all lines of its pedigree to Mr. Llewellyn's kennel in England around 1900 or before. And that to me says bred too close.
Yep. That's understandable. All right. Well, hey, everybody, I'm going to start wrapping this up, and I want to, thank Tom for coming on. I want to ask everybody to, make sure you share this. Let's spread the word. This is one of the many ways we can help continue to grow this sport and keep it, going on for into the future. We need to, keep new people coming in, and this is another opportunity to share some of the stuff they would be seeing at field trials and what we've been kind of going through in the past and how great they are. And feel free to reach out to me if anybody's got any suggestions or anything you think we should be doing more of or better. And I've been getting great recommendations on guests, and we're going to keep doing this as long as people like to watch them. So, Tom, you got any last words for us tonight?
No, just thank you to all of the people, owners, handlers, landowners, fellow bums like me that have shown me so much fun over many, many years. I love y'all.
Oh, that's great. Yep, that's great. Hey, Bill Holton signing off for Tom Word and Field Trial Central Live. We will see you all next time, and have a great night. Thanks.
And stay well and safe.